It's a Middle Eastern patch of sand that promises the best of everything, from hotels and shopping to vibrant nightlife. In one generation, Dubai's transformed itself from an Arab fishing village into an international travel hub for business and pleasure.
If you fly into Dubai today, it looks like a Middle Eastern version of Las Vegas or Surfers Paradise.
But behind the flashy facade are some brutal traps for the unsuspecting.
Qantas is now diverting hundreds of thousands of Australians through Dubai on their way to Europe, but what you don't see in the Qantas brochures is an explanation of what can happen to you in Dubai. A young Australian couple sharing a hotel room can be arrested for adultery. If that couple are homosexuals, the consequences are even more severe. There have been women who've been gang raped there who have then been convicted of engaging in adultery and had prison terms imposed upon them. It may look like a Middle Eastern version of Las Vegas, but it's very far from that.
The glittering miracle city has a legal system anchored in the Dark Ages. Justice can be cruel and capricious. Guilt or innocence can be arbitrary. And in a land where money is king, some of the worst crimes are financial. Find yourself accused of fraud or even bouncing a cheque, and you're in for a rough ride, even if you're innocent.
Thrust in through the front door with a few people yelling at you as you're entering, "Good, we've got some white meat." You certainly, being an accountant, you're not really trained for that.
Tonight we go inside the terrifying 5-year ordeal of Australians caught in the quicksand of Dubai justice.
What can you do? Who do you go to? There was nothing I could do. Nothing.
We were all devastated. We couldn't believe that it was actually happening.
This story has literally been years in the making. We've been following the private agony of an Australian couple caught in a legal nightmare after Dubai's insane property boom collapsed. What's happened to them is shocking, but it's also had to remain a secret. Now, for the first time, Marcus and Julie Lee tell their story. Years ago, foreign correspondent came to Dubai to examine the wreckage of a spectacular commercial crash. The global financial crisis had reached the United Arab Emirates and popped Dubai's bubble.
There are thousands and thousands of unfinished properties lying around on the desert, unattended. People either just dump them or they can't make the payments. You know, it's a big dilemma for everybody now.
If you had an inkling of how Dubai deals with financial failure and you had the money for an airfare, you left your expensive car in the airport car park and bolted. One French businessman had even dressed as an Emirati woman to escape a deal gone wrong and fled by boat.
When they put you in jail, it's not for 3 or 5 years. They put you in jail until you pay what they want you to pay. So if you don't pay or if you cannot pay, regardless of the reason, they keep you in jail indefinitely.
And you didn't have to be in prison to be trapped. Osman, how are you?
Fine.
Yeah. So this is the room. This is where you all live.
Yes, 18 people living here.
18 people in this
Yes.
room. Poor construction workers like these Bangladeshis couldn't leave Dubai. Their passports were in the hands of employers who hadn't paid wages for 6 months.
Police ke bolle police bole koda jao. Bole ওখানে ফাইল তৈরি করো, এ করো সে করো, কোম্পানি থেকে পাসপোর্ট নিয়ে আসো। বা আমাদের টাকা নেই, আমরা কিভাবে যাব, ট্যাক্সি কিভাবে নেব, গাড়ি কোথায় যাব, আমরা চিনি না।
One day, we basically all turned up at work, and that night the place had just collapsed. Overnight, the banks in Dubai basically stopped lending.
Marcus Lee was one of many Australians caught up in the property crash. He was on the management team of a huge waterfront project owned by the state development company Nakheel. But he and his wife, Julie Lee, decided to stay, convinced the bad times still held opportunity.
There's two things that happen in development. When things are going good, there's a lot of work to do. When things aren't going good, there's a lot of work to do as well.
It would turn out to be the worst decision of their lives. They were about to become ensnared in a harrowing legal drama over a multi-million-dollar property deal. The stakes were huge, and so were the players. A billionaire sheikh, his all-powerful property company Nakheel, and an Australian developer, Sunland. On Australia Day 2009, police invited Marcus Lee downtown for a few questions.
Yeah, well, their first question was, do you know why you're here? And I said, no, I don't know why I'm here. Then they started to ask me, do I know this person and this person and this person, names that I'd never heard of before. And certainly people I hadn't met. And I said, well, no, I don't know. And then I started to get a little bit concerned, where one of the more senior guys looked at me and looked a bit frustrated and said, you're lying. And so I thought at that point, yes, this is going to be a different day.
Marcus was thrown into a cell at National Security Headquarters, unaware of what he was supposed to have done.
I was kept in solitary for a bit over 2 months, where I basically didn't even have a bathroom. We're back to real basics there. It was a room 2.5 metres by 1.5 metres. It had a bed in it. It had a mattress on building blocks, if you call that a bed. Had a hole in the bottom of the door where I was fed 3 times a day, and mostly food that I couldn't eat. And basically at that point I was cut off from anybody, denied legal representation, denied to contact Julie to at least tell her where I've gone, what's happened. And it was just nothing other than torturous conditions.
Julie Lee was at her mother's 80th birthday party in Australia when she got news of his arrest. She flew straight back, but was allowed only a brief phone call once a week.
We try and work together and try and say, okay, be strong, keep going, keep going. And then we'd say, okay, they're taking the phone away. And you'd say, I love you, I love you. And then that would be it. And then I'd keep trying to find out more information. And that was all I'd ever get from Marcus, just those few minutes.
In the filthy conditions and still in the dark about the accusations against him, Marcus soon contracted gastroenteritis and pneumonia, all made worse by severe asthma. Denied proper food and medicine, he fell gravely ill.
Once you got ill, you were on your own. You had to fend for yourself. It was either that or getting moved to the main police hospital, which apparently was worse than the detention centre. I got to the point where I had a temperature of about 103, and it was one of those points when delirium sets in and you're fearful for your life at that point.
When Julie finally saw him, she realised he was dying.
He'd lost about over 10% of his body weight. This was in 7 weeks or less. He was severely dehydrated, and there was something else as well. Oh, your blood pressure, that's right. It was extreme. And
one of the tests started to, we found out later that I was actually, my body was closing down, relying a lot on its fatty tissues, so I was actually starting to urinate blood.
Julie managed to get him antibiotics that saved his life. But he was still desperately sick when he was moved from solitary to a general detention centre.
Yeah, well, there was everything from petty thieves and check bouncers to we had a group of serial killers in there. So to be one of the only Westerners, and I think there was about 4 Westerners in there, it was quite a daunting thing to come out of a room where there was severe psychological trauma. I can say that now, like a year and a half down the track.
One of those Westerners was Marcus Lee's former boss, Matt Joyce, another Australian who'd brought his family to Dubai to ride the boom time. He'd worked with Marcus on the Dubai Waterfront project, owned by the state developer Nakheel. But even he couldn't tell Marcus why they were there.
No, it was very confusing, very confusing. Marcus and I would talk at hours on length of trying to establish what was going on.
In desperation, Julie called Marcus's oldest friend in Australia, Rosemary Adams, a psychologist and businesswoman with a knack for getting things done. She flew straight to Dubai and went straight to the jail to see Marcus.
He couldn't walk without holding onto the walls. He'd lost masses of weight, he's really thin. His skin was a grey-green colour. It was just horrible. Because don't forget, their jails aren't, you don't get out in the air, you don't see any life or anything. It's all inside because it's 45 degrees outside. So you're in a room, with walls, floors and ceilings. Matt, he was healthier than Marcus, but he was obviously very distressed. He was frantic actually at times, and so because he was talking to me because a bit where he could, but his wife also visited him every day too. But at that stage, the other thing is that none of us knew what was going on. There's no charges. We didn't know what it was about.
2 months later, and still without charges, Marcus Lee and Matt Joyce were sent to Dubai's main prison. It was so overcrowded, they had to share a bed.
It was just a riot. It was a 24-hour-a-day riot. And basically, when things started to fly, you ducked. If you didn't duck, you get hit. And just hope you weren't on the other side of some of the fights. But even when I used to call Julie on the telephone, sometime a fight would break out and Julie'd even be able to hear it on the other end. One of the times actually I was even on a telephone and I got knocked off the telephone and the telephone just left there hanging. Julie could hear this ruckus happening in the background of another fight that I wasn't involved in, but I just got cleaned up in the process. And God knows what that was like for Julie, to just hear a fight happening on the other end of a prison. And when I'm talking a fight here, there's no schoolyard pushing. It's like literally people grabbing whatever they could, metal trays, pipes, anything they can break off anything. It's a violent place, a very violent place. And that is largely due to, look, there's inactivity, there's overcrowding, it's locked down 24 hours a day and everybody's shoveled into one room. 250 people per room, effectively.
Finally, after 7 months, they found out the charges against them. They were accused of a massive fraud that could see them jailed for a decade. The Australian company Sunland claimed they had swindled it out of $14 million on a land deal at Dubai Waterfront.
It was shock and horror and trying to analyse why, what for. We were just told that we, as you said, we defrauded them and we didn't know when, why or how. So that was even worse.
They were desperate to get out of prison and fight the charges, but the Australian government seemed powerless to help. So supporters of Matt Joyce turned to a former foreign minister turned consultant for hire.
So in the end, my intervention was with the Crown Prince of the United Arab Emirates, who I know, and I really asked if he could be released from prison on bail pending the trial.
Alexander Downer's letter to the Crown Prince, delivered by the Australian Embassy, made no mention of Marcus Lee.
I just simply wasn't approached about him, so I simply don't know about his case.
He was going to raise the case for the people who were going to pay the $60,000, and we couldn't afford to pay, so we were not involved in that.
And was any money paid in the end?
I can't be sure. I don't know.
What was your reaction, though, to a former foreign minister asking for money to raise the case of Australians trapped in your situation?
I wasn't that impressed.
I didn't charge them in the end, no. And in any case, what's more, it was to be a success fee, if memory serves me well, and how could I ever prove what contribution I'd made? The other thing to say about this is I'm not sure how appropriate it is to collect money doing that sort of thing. So ever since I finished up as the Foreign Minister, I have never been paid for any intervention on a consular issue in that way.
After 9 months, they were finally released on bail. Marcus managed to put on a smile for his family in Australia, but the bail had cost him and Julie everything they had.
Well, we had to basically scrape every bit of savings we possibly could together and credit card, and Julie scrambled to put together 300,000 Australian dollars, and that was to sit bonded in the government. And both Julie and my passports had to be basically handed over, surrendered.
She had to surrender her passport.
Yes,
Yeah, so
absolutely. Yes.
Julie, whilst not being charged or not being even alleged to have committed a crime, is trapped here as well.
Like many expatriates, they had come to Dubai to chase a dream. They'd met in the 1980s when he was a labourer and she was a dancer.
Like, I still remember, like, at 17 years old, to get a 23-year-old is a real catch.
They put themselves through university in Queensland, graduated as accountants and found work in property firms. In 2006, they decided to try their luck in one of the biggest construction booms in history. So when you first came here, Marcus, there was a bit of a buzz in the place?
A buzz, that's an understatement, it was manic.
The new Sheikh, Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum, had directed the 3 state development companies to get developing.
And like, one thing he did have is vision. You can't deny that.
A very big vision.
Yeah.
The idea was to create a new economy of commerce and tourism to replace Dubai's dwindling oil reserves. Marcus Lee became commercial director on the biggest construction project, Dubai Waterfront.
Just even to have the opportunity to work on the largest development in the world is an incredible opportunity. And at the same time, we were just trying to save enough money to buy a house in Australia and just get that little bit ahead, I guess, and be able to get a deposit, and like a lot of Australians, try to buy a house and own a house in Australia.
Dubai Waterfront was meant to double the city's size, filling every centimetre of open coastline.
In the world's fastest growing city, something is happening. Something of unprecedented scale. Something that will spark the next generation of development. It's brought to you by Nakheel, where the vision of Dubai gets built.
The global financial crisis killed the project stone dead, leaving little more than a pile of sand on the Arabian Peninsula.
There was about 1,500 villas, and they were all pre-sold.
And now there's just a half-finished bridge.
Yeah, well, 2 half-finished bridges, because we're in the distance. You might be able to see one up there. One was Samsung and one was Taisei, and they were about $1 billion each.
This was the scene of the alleged crime. In 2007, Sunland decided to buy a land plot here called D17. Its aim was to build a giant twin tower that would dominate the waterfront. But according to Sunland, it was told another Australian company, Prudentia, headed by Melbourne businessman Angus Reid, had negotiating rights to the property, effectively first dibs. Based on that understanding, Sunland paid Prudentia $14 million to cede those rights. Sunland was then clear to purchase the plot from Nakheel, and it did. But 2 years later, Sunland became convinced it had been conned into paying that $14 million. It resolved that Prudentia didn't have a saleable hold on D17 to sell.
They have received unlawfully 14 million from us that they were not entitled to.
Angus Reid had already left the country, but police arrested Marcus Lee and his boss Matt Joyce on suspicion they were part of the alleged sting. All 3 men denied any wrongdoing, Marcus Lee insisting he'd had nothing to do with the deal.
Did you do this?
Of course not. Sunland bought it of their own free will. I was not involved at any time into their arrangements with any other company. Yet, because I wrote a business case report for the board that was approved by the senior management, it's alleged that I've partnered in the so-called crime.
Did you get any money for this?
Not 1 dirham.
Do they acknowledge that?
Yes.
So they acknowledge that you didn't get any money, you just did your job?
Yes.
But you're still trapped in this whole investigation?
That's right. And that's the way, unfortunately, it's probably going to be until it goes right through the court process.
Back in Australia, Rosemary Adams managed to find a lawyer prepared to help Marcus for free. Brisbane lawyer John Snedden had no doubt Marcus was innocent, but he had no illusions that would free him in a court system that could drag on for years.
Oh, it's a very frightening system. I've had so many sleepless nights worrying about what could happen, and lawyers like to control things. It's just ingrained in us, and I appreciate that in every case you put your best case forward and then you lose control. It's in the hands of the judge. In this one, I realised I could control so many things, but we had no control over the system itself, and that's what was terrifying.
6th summer here, and 3rd since this happened.
Yeah, we'll survive.
At least it's not a summer in a jail.
Marcus and Julie were scared the authorities would punish them if they criticised the system. But in 2011, as the trial dragged on interminably, they agreed to talk. Their one condition was that we didn't broadcast anything until they were safely home. None of us could imagine how long that might take.
Our lives are on hold. We're supposed to live on fresh air in the meantime. I haven't had any income now for 2 years. We've pretty well exhausted every saving.
All that we worked for.
Everything we worked for, every saving. Yeah. Lost our family home in Australia now. And even if I'm acquitted, we've still paid a massive penalty.
Marcus and Julie's families were suffering too. Marcus's mother, Carol McKinley, lives in Sydney's Sutherland Shire. She couldn't tell her own mother of Marcus's arrest, knowing it would be too much for her to bear.
She was 91 at that stage and not well. We thought it was better she just didn't know about it, and we would print photos of Marcus and Julie and put them up in the nursing home, so Happy Easter Nan and things like that. So she wasn't aware.
She died without seeing him again. Carol's second husband, Alan, the only father Marcus had ever known, was desperate to see him. He was battling cancer.
My husband, when he did pass away, he was very distressed at only being able to speak to Marcus once when he was in the hospice on the day that he was admitted. Marcus rang him on the mobile phone and they said goodbye.
And he couldn't come to the funeral, of course. He couldn't do anything like that.
No. And they knew that it was the last conversation they'd have.
DFAT are actively involved, but there is still a genuine line from them that, well, we can't involve ourselves in other countries' legal affairs, just like...
1 year later, Marcus and Julie were starting to wonder if they'd ever see home.
Now we're into another year, so the third year, and it's just exhausting.
So when New Year's Day rolled around, did you think this will be the year?
No, I just went, it's another year.
The authorities had forbidden Marcus to work. He spent his days on a treadmill.
We try to do a bit of exercise and try to keep mentally sane, I guess.
Julie found part-time work as an accountant, but spent most of her time poring through the case, preparing for hearings that would almost always be postponed.
Oh, crazy is not the word. It continue doing many marathons in your mind all the time, how to navigate through the system, and we're learning every day about what to do, what not to do. We question ourselves what we should have done, shouldn't have done, but we just continually hit walls, it seems. 27 hearings now down the track in total. We're still yet to really lodge our defence, which is what we really want to do.
Hi, Carol.
Hi, Marcus. Hi, Julie.
The only way to see their families was through the internet.
Yes, I was sick for probably about 9 months or so.
Yeah.
Marcus's mother, Carol, was trying to hold things together in Sydney.
Just hoping every day and praying every day that Marcus and Julie will be home soon.
Obviously, I'm very worried for them. They're under such immense pressure that it is having an adverse effect upon their health, but I've no doubt that they'll just keep soldiering on the way they have for the last 4.5 years.
John Snedden continued to fight their case unpaid, lobbying politicians across Australia for help and travelling back and forth to Dubai.
They don't start a trial on a Monday and work for 8 hours a day for as many days as it takes until it ends. Everyone shows up for an hour and comes back in a month or 2 or 3 months for another hour. And so there's no end in sight. And the legal system is such that you can have an entirely different panel of judges determining the merits of the case than the ones who actually heard the evidence 3 or 4 years earlier.
Making matters worse, a court-approved Emirati who'd gone guarantor on Marcus's bail was shaking them down for more money. He was threatening to revoke his guarantee, meaning Marcus would be sent back to prison.
We've paid him in total probably about 60 or 70,000 Australian dollars. The actual worst thing about all of that, he actually doesn't threaten me, he threatens Julie.
The court's still taken no action against him?
No, our lawyer raised it with the judge at one point, and it was quite strange. The judge thought it was quite funny, either in disbelief or maybe he did find it funny.
And according to John Snedden, Sunland was doing its best to get Marcus jailed.
Sunland sent along their lawyers to 30 court hearings, and they would go along and sit in the gallery, sometimes bringing their families, like it was a sporting event. Their lawyer, at the end of the prosecution case, stood and shouted to the court that Marcus and the other defendants should be convicted, and they should be imprisoned, and they should be given the maximum jail term.
Look at this shark looking. They're looking at you.
It is too.
Marcus Lee was furious he'd been caught up in this prosecution and cut all contact with his former boss, Matt Joyce. There had never been any hard evidence tying him to the contentious deal, and all agreed he hadn't been paid a cent. Eventually, even Sunland would concede he played no part in their scenario.
Only during the court case, when the evidence emerged, when our lawyer had the opportunity to look at everything, then later on, almost 1 year later, we find out that maybe Marcus has nothing to do with that.
Yet Marcus was still on trial.
Yes, for a deal that they did that I wasn't involved in. So it's not only I went to jail because of their misstatements, I went to jail too for a deal that they did with somebody else.
Suhaila Bedian also pursued Matt Joyce and Angus Reid in Australia, accusing them of misleading and deceptive conduct. It was a disaster. Victoria's Supreme Court ruled Sunland hadn't been tricked into paying $14 million. It had paid it to make Prudential walk away, so Sunland wouldn't have to share the profits. And the judge was scathing about Suhaila Bedian and the head of Sunland's Dubai operations, David Brown. He called them unreliable witnesses, tantamount to saying they were liars. Under cross-examination, David Brown had conceded he made false statements to Dubai investigators.
To be blamed as a liar or as somebody cannot be trusted, it is hard. But do I know that is not true? Yes. Do my friends know? Yes. Do my family know? Yes.
We were stunned. And the first time we heard about this is we opened a newspaper. We were sent a newspaper overnight, and the headline was something like, "Witness admits giving false statements to the Dubai authorities."
False statements that put you in jail?
Yes, yes. So do you think the prosecutors will call us today or this week sometime?
It'll be this week.
3 days before Marcus was due to lodge his defence, Sunland finally sent his lawyer John Snedden a letter confirming it had no complaint against Marcus.
The first letter was received in April of 2012, so more than 3 years after Marcus had been arrested. It was after Marcus had served time in jail. It was after 3 members of his family had died. It was after the evidence in the Australian court case had closed, and it was after the prosecution had closed its case in Dubai, and Sunland's lawyer in Dubai had demanded that Marcus be convicted.
What would you like to say to Suhaila Bedian?
He's one of the most abominable people that I've ever sort of had the displeasure of knowing about. I just can't believe that he's acted this way. And it's what he's done to the family, to Marcus himself and to our families, is just shocking.
There you go.
In July 2012, we stopped over in Dubai again on the eve of a hearing Marcus was sure would set him free.
Boy.
What the Sunland letter does now is really close off on specific allegations towards me, and it's something that we've been really requesting and now demanding for quite some time.
But the following day, his hopes were crushed. Instead of acquitting him, a new judge ruled there should be a new review. After more than 3 years, it seemed he was back to square one.
It's just continual bewilderment.
We returned nearly a year later to find them still waiting. They'd given up thinking about going home. On May 20, Julie returned to court for the 40th time. Marcus stayed home. An expert panel had reviewed the case, but after all the disappointments, they hardly dared to hope. Then, suddenly... So what happened?
It's just incredible.
You just walked in there and they said you're a free man?
Julie did. Julie went down there this morning and she rang me, and just unbelievable. Incredible.
Can you believe it, finally?
It's still sinking in. It's still... It's just, we're just trying to let it sink in. It just doesn't seem quite real yet.
It's sort of, you're pinching yourself thinking, is this really happened or not?
We left Dubai thinking that for Marcus and Julie at least the worst was over, but their relation didn't last long. 3 weeks later we were returning from another assignment and stopped off in Dubai. The prosecutor had just appealed against the acquittal.
I just remember getting the call from the lawyers, and we'd spent the last 2 weeks. You could actually see the physical change in both of us. We were laughing. We sort of were getting better sleep. We were just enjoying life. It was such a wonderful feeling. And then in the afternoon, I got a call from the lawyer, and he said that they've lodged an appeal. It's against all 4 parties, and I just didn't know what to do. I didn't want to tell Marcus, because I thought we've actually had some relief after all these years of stress and fear, and it was terrifying. I just thought, I can't do this anymore. It's been so long, it's been so hard.
For Matt Joyce, the news was far, far worse. He was convicted of fraud and sentenced to 10 years in prison and a $25 million fine. The treatment of foreigners like them had done nothing to dissuade tourism to the desert city. Thanks to Qantas sharing flights with the state airline Emirates, ever more were Australian.
And I know people laugh, oh look, you can get thrown in jail for kissing or something like that and think it's all a myth, but it happens, it's real. It really does happen. Like one of the guys when I was in jail, he was in there because he was transiting through Dubai airport with a breast cancer awareness t-shirt that had a silhouette of a female on a pink breast cancer awareness t-shirt, and somebody took offence and he was in jail. I was in there with him, so I've seen this.
We began to wonder if Marcus would ever get home. After so many years, it seemed Dubai's authorities would never lose face by admitting they'd hounded an innocent man. But on the 10th of November, something extraordinary happened. A higher court threw out every charge against Marcus Lee and Matt Joyce. The decision came just days after Australia's new Prime Minister, Tony Abbott, had raised the case with the Crown Prince.
Okay, Dads, I always give you some, don't I?
Marcus and Julie ready to leave as soon as they'd organised quarantine for their faithful Yorkshire Terrier, Dudley.
Oh, good boy.
But Dubai would not let go so easily.
You've been through a lot too.
As they were due to board the flight to Sydney, Marcus rang his mother, Carol.
Marcus rang me at about 5 p.m. and said, we've been held up at the airport and we're not on the plane.
It turned out their names were still on the airport's stop list. It was 3 days before the mess was sorted out and Carol could at last drive out to meet them.
I was devastated, but I thought, knowing Marcus, he'll sort it out, you know, and we've had many setbacks before, so this is was just another one.
The final insult though, wasn't it?
It sort of was, yes.
finally the moment they had thought of for so long. Free of the United Arab Emirates, they could finally start to tell their story of the lost years, the endless fear, the terrible injustice.
Unfortunately, I've been caught up in the middle of a grubby dispute between a lot of self-interest property developers and, look, going through on the other side now, we just want to try and get on with our lives and start to not feel so threatened and see our family again and learn what they look like. And
Matt Joyce and his family were back in Australia too, the Dubai court overturning his conviction and 10-year jail term.
This period has been enormously difficult for me, Ange and my family. We went overseas and never imagined anything like this could happen to us. Now 7 judges in 3 courts across 2 countries have found me innocent. Justice has finally been served.
But there'd be no reunion between the two men who'd once shared a single bunk in Dubai's overcrowded jail, puzzling about why they were there.
No, it was very confusing, very confusing. Marcus and I would talk at hours on length of trying to establish what was going on.
So you just really had no idea what you were supposed to do?
No, we got snippets of information, as much as we could, and we tried to piece it together. But it was very confusing. We effectively had no idea, Eric.
It was during that stretch that Marcus Lee first learned Matt Joyce was friends with the other Australian accused of fraud, Angus Reid of Prudentia. They'd attended the same elite school, Geelong Grammar, and worked on property deals in Australia. Emails obtained by foreign correspondent revealed the matey nicknames they gave each other.
They're basically claiming that you were a consultant to Prudentia, that you had some cosy arrangement with Prudentia. What was the relationship with Prudentia and with Angus Reid?
I did a job for them in 2005. Simple as that, a planning approval job. And as I said, it was broken down before. If I was a consultant for them, why wasn't that shown by the judges?
But this consultancy agreement obtained from court files asserts Matt Joyce was a paid consultant for Angus Reid's company Prudentia, and it was specifically about Middle Eastern properties. Then there's this. Remember how Sunland paid $14 million to Reid's company Prudentia to give up its development rights on Block D17? Soon after, Angus Reid transferred half the amount, the equivalent of $7 million, into Matt Joyce's bank account on Jersey Island.
But as the courts found, 7 judges found, it was a completely transparent, legitimate transaction. It is part of every normal day business.
Emails between the bank, Joyce and Reid became the focus of investigators in Dubai. The Standard Bank of Jersey Island requested evidence in writing about the source and nature of the funds. Matt Joyce sent the bank his 2006 consultancy agreement with Reid as evidence of his complete transparency without further compromising my position with Prudentia. Angus Reid writes to the bank on the same day, stating the money represents 50% of the net proceeds pursuant to his commercial arrangements between Prudentia and Joyce. Matt Joyce says he can explain it all quite simply.
Prudentia didn't have a bank account in Dubai. They needed to hold the money in a trust account until they worked out their tax situation. So that was documented, approved, drafted by lawyers and accountants, approved by Nikhil, all very legitimate. Sunland tried to twist it around to suit their own means.
Isn't it ironic that somebody would say, Mr. Reid didn't have any account, so I took exactly 50% of it to keep for him. Not 49.5%, not 61.2%, exactly 50% of it, based on agreement that they have signed previously. If he didn't have an account, why didn't he leave all the 100% with him? Why would he leave only 50% of that?
Did you keep half the money, as they claim?
No, that's one of Sunland's lies that they continue to push.
A year later, around the same time Dubai prosecutors were asking questions about the D17 deal, Matt Joyce transferred most of the money back to Angus Reid. He kept $1.25 million, which he says he was owed from a previous property deal in Australia.
All the evidence, all the facts were before the courts. The courts have made an emphatic ruling that we were framed by Sunland for their ulterior purpose, commercial and personal gain. And you can't refute the facts, you can't refute the evidence.
Angus Reid never returned to Dubai and was convicted in absentia. He's now based in New York and declined to be interviewed. Sunland's Suhail Abedian continues to maintain his rage against Matt Joyce and Angus Reid.
If no one else knows, if you don't know, Matt knows what he has done. Angus knows what he has done.
So you wouldn't be scared of Matt Joyce suing you?
I love that. Please bring it on. Please, if you see him, say that is the only message that Suhail has for you. Bring it on.
What's in there? Oh my God. I don't even know what's in there.
Marcus and Julie have come back to rented accommodation and a few dusty boxes they left in storage.
Oh, we do have a heater.
But their reputations and dignity are intact. On Australia Day, they were able to enjoy the national celebrations with family on Sydney Harbour. It was exactly 5 years to the day since he was arrested. Finally, Marcus and Julie Lee were home.
I've got to believe this gives me a foundation for something else, and I don't know what that is. I can't tell you today what it is. What I'd like it to not be is, if you ever Google my name, Marcus Lee Fraud, I'd like it to be Marcus Lee, person with Julie Lee, a person who survived, people who survived Dubai in a horrific nightmare.